Hello, everyone. Welcome back to session 3 of Field Guide to Hardscapes. We are going to be, just wanted to send a quick thank you to Emerson for setting up our session, as well as for anybody that was able to make last week's remix or re-session on Monday. Appreciate everybody being flexible on that part of it as well. So there was a question last week about adding dimensions to the base plan. And just wanted to let everybody know that for the design schedule or for the design challenge part, there is a new uploaded part that is available, uploaded in Brightspace that just has all of the site parts together in 8.5 by 11. So if you have a home printer that doesn't have a larger format, you can print both the front and the back onto there too as well. So also just to let everybody know the class recording session, the makeup part was made up for it on should be uploaded to Brightspace now and taken care of there for it. So tonight, as I said, is session 3 for Field Guide to Hardscapes. We've covered a lot of terms in the last session. And last session, quite honestly, it was a lot of words and a lot of terms. Tonight we'll make up for that, and there will be a lot of images and there will be a lot of examples. So I aim for this to be a little bit more of a interesting visual class for it as opposed to a lot of terms for it today. So for what we're going to cover tonight, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and then we'll jump into our part, and we should everybody have that. And we'll be looking tonight as we kind of look through our where we've been. We've covered the paving parts in 1 and 2. Today we're going to be looking at retaining wall materials and garden structures. And as always, I'll hang on afterwards if anybody has any questions, but we'll go ahead and jump right into it as we go. And with that, we'll dive into what we're taking a look through. And just a quick reminder, if anybody has any questions, you want to run through anything on the design challenges, feel free to let me know, and we'll be available afterwards to talk through those things too. So cleverly thinking of 2 names for what we call the hardscape part. I just want to make sure we're good for here. We are calling it Hold It Right There because we're talking about retaining wall options. And obviously retaining walls sort of hold things in grade and in place. Give me 1 second to just do a little housekeeping item here. There we go. Should have our zoom window back up. All right. So for when we work through hardscape materials and we work through retaining walls, a lot of what we talk about for retaining works into holding back a vertical area. And the 2 most common terms that you'll find into that are going to be either cut or fill. So imagine if you've got a sloping grade and you want to put a flat surface into it, one of the options you can do is to cut back into a hillside, and you can put the retaining wall behind what you're going to try and flatten. Or if you have this flat area and you have this sloping hillside, you can push it out in front of it and you can fill in front. Or a lot of times people will do what's called a balanced cut and fill, where they do a little bit of both and they'll sort of work out the grade. Walls can sometimes add up and be a little bit expensive. And so when we're talking about adding cut and fill or adding retaining walls, we're always thinking about the size. And we'll kind of walk through some of the appropriate use. We'll talk through the limitations of some of the product types. Certainly with natural materials, there's a few things to keep in mind that are limitations just based on the fact that it's a non-engineered material and it can only really be installed safely and sort of from a legality standpoint or a liability standpoint. Natural materials are going to be a little bit more limited in their performance, whereas engineered materials, if you've ever driven around and gone through along the sides of a parking lot or a Home Depot. Home Depot is always really popular for them. Sometimes you'll see those huge retaining walls that just go up 30 feet, and they seem to put a very big area by leveling out a spot. So we'll cover those in the retaining walls for manufactured. They tend to have a lot more options as they go through them too. So as we're looking through natural stone, we'll look at what's called 2 things: dry laid stacked walls, so smaller unit sizes and much smaller pieces. And then when we get into natural stone, we're also going to look at that blown up a little bit more in this economy of scale. And those will be boulder or outcropping slab stone retainings as well. Then when we jump into prefabricated, we'll spend a little time, again, looking at that idea of a copycat material, what's trying to look like something else. and then some honest examples of it as well. Oop, here we go. Sorry about that. We'll jump back to sharing the screen. All right, we should be back to it for tonight for session 2. There we go. Thank you. Apologies for that. So as we're running through, again, natural stone, we'll be talking about dry stacked examples and some boulder retaining walls. Then for prefabricated, we'll look at some copycat and some honest examples. We'll go through some sizing things. Then we'll spend a little time at the end of the retaining wall part to talk about block and veneer masonry. And those are the ones that line up essentially on more on the architectural side, more on the structural side, but pretty much anything is possible when you get to those. And we'll cover each of those with some other parts. Our material review format should be pretty common and pretty recognizable for everybody at this point. Kind of go through the name and category and manufacturing origins of them, because that has a lot to do with what the material ends up looking like and performing as. We'll talk about some general awareness considerations for each. Then some of our industry standards as usual. We'll jump through a little bit of the terms and then have some additional resources for it too. So with that, we'll jump into the natural stone and the dry stack retaining walls. And as we talk about dry stone and natural stone and dry stack, sometimes you'll talk about that. And those are smaller parts. Those are things that without too much difficulty, you'll be able to take and pick up with 2 hands, lift it in place and move those segmental pieces into form and build a small wall. It's quarried material, so it's going to be like what we talked about from the natural stone and the dry laid paving. It's going to be the same sourcing, but instead of coming up with smaller units and bigger, flatter pieces, we're going to come up with a little smaller stack pieces. And so they're going to be essentially the same volume, but squished down and probably a little bit taller for it. The look for a natural stone retaining wall is going to be in that same category. We're going to have that unmatched sort of aesthetic. The precast material, some of them will try to hit that pretty well, but you're always going to be struggling to catch up with it on the precast material. There's a couple of rules of thumb to keep in mind when you talk about dry stack retaining walls. I'll show you some examples as we run through in a couple of the walls. I think for the most part, most of the walls are ones that I've worked on. But one of the rules of thumb to keep in mind is there's a limit from a dry stack retaining wall, which is 36 inches or less. From that standpoint, once you go above that part, we'll talk about some of the pressures and forces that act on all retaining walls, whether they're dry stacked or not. But once we start holding back grade and we have moisture and soil and everything else behind that wall, 36 inches is about the maximum that you can do safely with a dry stack wall. There's always examples where you can break that, but that's one of the ways where you can sort of step back. Above 36 inches, what you want to do is sort of step back in tiers. So if you go up 36, you want to go back at least 36 or more, and then step back again. So you're sort of stepping up in big steps. A couple things to keep in mind for it from a natural stone standpoint. There's a little bit of liability in working with natural stone. It's not something that you can't overcome, but just be aware that when you work with natural stone, it's a non-engineered product. And so as you're going through it, you have to look at some third-party rules, regulations, and building standards that are really helpful to keep in mind when you're working with a natural wall. The installation method is going to be pretty critical. And then if there are any issues, you'll want to identify the responsibility of, how that wall's performing. So the other mantra that I'll say sometimes is, when in doubt, hire it out for those walls that are dry stack walls. If you're doing something small and it's a 12 to 18 inch part, it's not critical. But once you start getting up above that and there's areas where those things could slough off or could give way, obviously it becomes a little bit more of a bigger deal if those walls should start to fail. From a sales and handling standpoint, consider this material as being brought in per pallet or per ton. I'll go ahead and just pull up a laser pointer here. But as you go through this, per pallet, per ton, if we look at that material, and I'll show you some examples of how it comes to job site. It's actually kind of nice because when it comes in the pallet, you'll actually see pretty much exactly what it will look like when it's being delivered and what it will look like installed because of the way that the pallets are formed. And what you'll get with dry stack part, and even with the other materials, instead of square footage, we're going to talk about face footage. And so face footage equates to a coverage per ton. You basically get a volume of this material, and you look at it and say, okay, we've got 858 pounds of material here. What does it equate to for the face footage? And generally there's a guide. Oftentimes with natural stone, you'll get about 40 as an average. Sometimes it's a little less, sometimes it's a little bit more. But based on the volume of a pallet, you'll oftentimes get about 40 face footage of material for coverage wise. So from a product itself, the material itself, when you start picking it up, and you see it in this image here, they're semi-consistent and they're mostly rectangular. There are other shapes and sizes, but for the most part, it's not an exact unit building block. Like we talked about before, when you're talking about a natural material, there's some give and take between the aesthetics and the performance. And the performance means that you have to spend a little bit more time and be a little bit more patient working with the material. Oftentimes, it's one of the things that no matter what I do with wall material, I usually will break all the pallets out, because sometimes the right stone might be in the pallet that's in the back. And as you work through it and sort of break open the areas, you start to look at it and go, oh, and it depends on the material, but you might need something that's this size, right? And you know there's one of it over there. So you spend a lot of time walking back and forth between the pallets and the area that you're working with it, with a tape measure, and kind of working back and forth to find the right pieces. From a size standpoint, you'll work at things that, and I'll show you examples of this also, the smallest thing you'll find is about an inch or so, and they range up to about 8 to 10 inches tall. So they're pieces that can be a little bit more sized. And from a depth part, about 6 to about 12 inches or so as you work through things. And then as they're delivered to a job site, generally it's on a flatbed, it's with equipment. Most times, depends on the delivery area itself in the company, but sometimes they'll even have what's called a spider on the back of the material, and they can take it off and put it into place for you. Otherwise, you'll really need equipment, because those pallets, again, are over a ton or more in terms of weight and volume, and they can be pretty heavy to move around with it as you go through it. So just to give you a little bit of the overall for it, I wanted to give you some common building terms with some examples. And one of the things that you'll see most often is what's called the batter. And the batter is basically just the angle between vertical and back to where the face of the wall is. And if you see number one, imagine if you had a level that was placed vertical here. And oftentimes masons that are working with dry stack walls will in fact they'll take a level and they'll build a board that's a lot like a wood jig, and they'll have a board here where their level is mounted to it, and then they'll have an offset angle to it that says between generally like 3 to 5 degrees, but often about 3 degrees or so. And essentially you'll take that batter board, and that will be their consistent part. If you hold this piece level, you'll be able to take a batter board and sort of lay it up against that part and make sure that your wall is being installed accurately and consistently as it goes. So that's one of the first building terms that we'll cover here, is just batter. The other part is backfill, and you'll see that this wall essentially is this curvilinear form. It's all of a limestone origin, and it's semi-coursed and semi-consistent. But what you'll notice is that this area down below, which is going to have some steppers and some planting in it, is way below this part. It's about, finished grade will be about 28 inches or so from one to the other. So there will be a patio surface up in this area here, and everything that's going behind the wall is lifted up in compacted levels of gravel, and that's our backfill. Essentially, this would stay here without backfill for a little while until something bumped it or until some freeze thaw kind of moved it. But when you have this wall go through here, you're filling this up on the backside, and it's backfill. And then the other thing to keep in mind is you'll notice that this is pretty horizontal material and pretty consistent. And the other, so what you'll say is that each of those is going down in individual courses of material as it goes up. Again, these terms are all in the handout for it. So if you don't have the handout, don't feel like you have to scramble to write everything down. Certainly that stuff is available in the other. So really the name of the game for this is not only keeping everything running horizontally level, but also making sure that that batter stays consistent when you work with it, because natural stone, the last thing you want to do essentially is lay it without any batter, because at that point, our biggest enemy for stone and stone walls is hydrostatic pressure. When you lay, this was the very first wall that I'd ever built. I think back when I was 17 or 18, I started on this wall for my a house that was out in northern New Jersey. And you'll see two different things. This is just actually just plastic. It's a drop cloth to keep the work area dry and to make sure that we weren't working in muddy conditions. This is a natural outcropping of slate that we were able to build the wall on top of. And what you'll see down below is geotextile, which we'll talk about in a second. But the hydrostatic pressure, for instance, what we'll talk about, this finished wall is about 4 feet tall, then it steps back about 6 feet, then it goes up about 3, and then it's back into it. So accrued, you have 7 feet of pressure on this wall section, and it's going to want to push, push, push the whole time. So from this part, all the water that's building up from here, natural groundwater, is going to need to find a home and a way to get out of it. And that hydrostatic pressure is always going to be wanting to push, push, push on the wall to make sure that it wants to essentially fail the wall. So all of the gravel backfill that's in here is an aggregate. We didn't worry about drain tile here because we essentially opted to just do a gravel backfill. So any of the wall water that pushes through there hits the gravel, finds its path of least resistance, and works its way out to the bottom of the wall. And that relieves what we call the hydrostatic pressure on it. We also find it's really important to use geotextile. Geotextile is essentially a filter fabric that keeps the dirt on one side and it keeps the clean gravel on the other. If you didn't have it, eventually the soil and silt that's in the soil would work its way through there. It would clog and foul the gravel, and then the hydrostatic pressure would have been built up, and eventually it would push the wall over. And the last just infrastructure term, the other part before we show some examples of those, is a dead man. And as ominous as it sounds, it's essentially if you have a wall that kind of runs up to it, every so often you take a longer linear piece and you run it back into the wall. So if this is the wall face here, every so often you just run a longer piece back into the wall, and the combined pressure of everything holds that down, and the dead man just holds it like an anchor, essentially would hold a boat, so that it keeps it from pushing forward. Because essentially what you're doing when you're building a dry stack wall is taking a bunch of little segmental pieces, and the strength of it is in mass, again, with all of it coming together and building, and then it prevents, you essentially hold it back with a bunch of small segmental pieces.
Do you have a picture of that?
Of the dead man, I think I might be in some of the other issues. Let me show you. I would say any of the longer pieces, like if we went back to this and you had a longer piece through here, it's really common in timber tie walls, and you'd have to use a longer piece here, but imagine if a piece was there for it. That's about the best photo I've got to help. As we look through this and show some examples for it, some of the dry stack wall examples, and I'll just show you in variation. This is the second wall I think that I built probably when I was, I don't know if the first one was 17, this was about 19 or so. And this was, when you hear the term fieldstone walls in Pennsylvania, this legitimately was a fieldstone wall, because around this property, I was an intern at Fallingwater for a season. And one of the projects that we were tasked with doing was to build a landscape for this historic cabin that they had moved. We suggested using fieldstone. They said, great, go collect the fieldstone. So we spent the first week with a larger vehicle and some four-wheelers going to actually collect the stonework out of the freeze-thaw stone fences that were around the area. So this is one of the other areas here that was it. Fieldstone's wonderful, and it's a great material to work with. It's also got a lot of shape, and sometimes there's some dips and some other angles to it. So it's putting together another big puzzle. You can kind of see that. One of the other examples, and we'll show you a few more of those in just the general range of some of those materials. Pennsylvania bluestone is great, and actually the quarries do a nice job of selling every last bit of it down to gravel and other fines. But one of the things that they'll use are the smallest pieces that they can't sell. Generally, people will call them clinkers because they're the smaller pieces that you can't use as a paving stone anymore. And they'll oftentimes bundle that up into small unit pieces. So those will range between about an inch as a starting point, might go up to about 2 inches. But they're the cut-off leftover materials from paving areas that are broken that they'll sell as a small wall. They can be mortared in place, or they can be laid dry. The nice part about them is they're super flat, so you can build quite a bit with them as you go. Two more examples. I can hear thunder behind me. That's a great sign. Two more examples just for here, and then we'll show you a couple other as we go. But this is, again, naturally harvested stone, so a little bit more rough and organic. But in this instance, you can start to see the steps This first wall starts at about, it's about 24 or so and ranges to about 18 as the slope goes up. The other one's sort of consistently 18. The other one's about 20 or 12 inches or so. But the idea, instead of building one consistent wall with dry stack and having it push, 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 is to step and step and step a few times. And then again, another example of that clinker wall that's here with a rain garden, everything that was instance here. The idea for this was to make sure that as my kids were young, they had an opportunity to lift things up and find critters. And so these pieces were small. And so it was nice because you could look up and you could find a red eft, or you could find salamanders. You can find all the things that would naturally be occurring. And if you got lucky, you didn't find a snake. So a few more examples through here. One of the great things about dry stone is you get exactly an idea from the material yard. You see exactly what it's going to look like when it gets to your job site because of the way it's bundled. Generally, a pallet's about a 4x4 or a little bit smaller. One nice part about it is they use a chicken wire cage, so you can look at it and see, oh, that's what the face of my wall is going to look like if you just extrapolate that out. But one of the things to keep in mind, and that's why I talked about using some when you order you order a little bit more overage, because sometimes, well, not sometime, I guess every time I've ever opened a pallet, I found this. What you'll find is all the good stone material is squared out in the edges, and the fill material and stuff that is seconds or less is usually used to fill the center of the pallet itself. So you'll get a great outside part and you'll look at it and go, oh, that's awesome. I can use every bit of it. No, I can't. And a lot of times what you'll find is that a good dry stone mason will know that first off, but then they'll also start to take that material and lay a little bit deeper backfill in spaces so they can kind of fill up as they go and not have to haul a lot of material out. Helps to sometimes build a double wall. If you know you've got an area on the base, you could build a little bit of a double wall, fill the area with, fill that void, and then you can continue to build up and use the best pieces for the facing pieces as well. And then oftentimes, one of the great things about it is, if you look through natural stone and you go through and even spend any time driving around Pennsylvania, anywhere to it, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, this was in South Central Pennsylvania, down around Harrisburg, Hershey area. But this was a wall that was well outdated, or well outlasted the barn foundation that was there. And this was partially retaining and also partially foundation work, but semi-dressed fieldstone material that came up, and it was from around 1850s. The barn was long gone and rotted and fallen over, but the stonework, based on the way it was worked and installed, was still there and still pretty viable for it too. And again, you'll see some of the stone fences that can be origins for it as they get picked up and reused for it. A couple of examples as we look through it, and then we'll jump to a little bigger version of this. And that would be the Stone Trust is a really wonderful public organization. They do a great job with training opportunities. They do a wonderful job. I've actually spec'd them or used their specification because it's a third party. They have wonderful specifications and details and methodology for places with freeze thaw. And so if you're ever looking for a standard, I remember doing a wall for somebody that wanted natural stone and then they didn't and went back and forth, ended up speccing and sourcing the Stone Trust as an example because it was a really wonderful, good set of instructions as to how to build. And they're recognized as sort of the voice for them. On a little larger part, we're going to go up from that smaller segmental piece up and scale up a little bit. And when I say scale up a little bit, like you get the choice between machinery rental or using a hernia or getting a hernia. The boulders and the larger stuff and outcropping, we're going to talk about two parts. Boulders, essentially, there's a nice onomatopoeia because it sounds right round, right? Boulders are larger. They're going to be football shaped and more rounded shapes, whereas outcropping is going to be a lot more horizontal and linear, and they're going to have a lot more of a linear feel to them. So when we talk about boulders, generally it feels a little bit more informal. Oftentimes you can see that there's space for planting and you can have soil backfill. So it's sort of a casual way to retain a slope without having to be super vertical. And the rule of thumb is if you're going to use a boulder wall, you really want to make sure that those boulders are embedded in the ground. You don't want to see them popping back up. So the rule of thumb for that would say bury a third to a half of the boulder in the actual backfill, and let a third to a half project outwards from it in the out of it from the ground level. So you're actually anchoring a lot of the soil or a lot of the material in the ground with it. Whereas outcropping walls are pretty much the exact opposite of it. I've got a couple photos coming up that have both outcropping and boulders in the same frame, so we can see those and kind of do a little bit of a comparison. But imagine that these are bigger, larger, rough slabs of material and very linear. You can cover a lot more, essentially where boulders are going to go up like a slope and a softer, maybe a 45-degree angle of repose. With outcropping, you can go vertical and you can do some nice things about poking them forward and get a little bit of a play to the stonework itself. So it's a lot more efficient way to hold grade when you're talking about boulders, but it's still very heavy and there's still certainly a craft in putting them together. You get a lot more efficiency when it comes to the vertical to the horizontal lift part. And while I would say that it's helpful to have it, at least on the base course, it's almost always helpful. Some people will try to do it with stone or sorry, with soil, but when it comes to the backfilling behind it, it's helpful to have a lot of gravel aggregate because it'll still help things drain through. And also the gravel's not going to move when you get a lot of rain, so it's not going to settle over time. You're going to be a lot more consistent in your install. And I'll show you examples of that as well.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
I learned in Asian garden design that always you put the rocks first. Is that true? Like the dry stack wall always goes in before like all the plants and everything?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Great point. And absolutely, it's you for sure want to have that stuff in first because it's also going to set the structure and set the grade of everything around you too. So for space and slope and purpose considerations, they serve similar functions, but they don't serve the same function. A couple examples of this as we get into them. This is a material called Michigan grindstone, which is basically the Midwest equivalent of a irregular bluestone slab that you could use as steps or you can use as an outcropping wall. And mixed in among that is with a granite boulder. And to your question, that's exactly what we did here is we set all the stonework here first and set the structure of the garden. And then we filled in afterwards and set and placed plant material. We even left and made sure that we left pockets for planting in between some areas. That way it allowed us to sort of say, you know, this looks like it might be a little bit of a harsh face. It's a lot of material, not a stone. Let's make sure we leave something here to soften it. So we would plant accordingly for it. And then, you know, for boulder walls, you know, the granite boulders here, if you looked off frame, essentially they're really large boulders. So they're holding back maybe about 2.5, 3 feet at most from top to bottom from the stairs. But they don't have to be that large. You know, these are smaller pieces that go to, I would say, like a good sized Coleman cooler and down, right? From a sizing standpoint, that's our technical measure. But in this part, it's really much more for retaining a moderate slope. And so from here to here, we really only have about 18 to 20 inches. It slopes down offside, so probably about 18 over here and 24 on the other side. And this was really just more meant to be a casual way to help slope between the two areas. And so the boulder part, you can also see sometimes, you know, again, this is an example where they didn't really bury a lot of it and they were actually trying to lift as much as possible. This was not a project that I was involved in, but I saw it in a spot where they were trying to create a berm and plant on top of it. And it's like you can kind of get an idea of what happens when you don't bury the boulders because it looks like this extruded, you know, oddity that kind of comes out of it. And so from anchoring them in the ground and planting around them versus, you know, leaving large ones standing up, you can still plant quite a bit of it. But if the grade came through here and was a little bit more gradual, it would look a little bit more natural. With the outcropping stone examples, we said before we had a couple of images where it had both material. You can kind of see number one in the background, see all these parts that are rounded. So those are our boulders that are there for accent purposes. And number two are the outcropping stones. So you get a sense of that linearity and how this is sort of holding down. This is a drainage basin in a large rain garden down below. And then this is just sort of holding the slope back and giving a little bit of an example. And between the two, you can really pave right up to the edge with outcropping stone. And when you look at the retaining wall part, you know, those rounded pieces sort of eat up a lot of space and they take up a lot of room. With outcropping, you can be a little bit more efficient, and you can even do things like having a planting area that comes right down to it. This was something I had set up to it. I had a sense that this is an area that's along a lake. I knew that people would sort of make that little adventurous jump to come out here and do fishing. It was nice to go back years later and actually find somebody that was fishing on that spot. And sometimes you can mix the two materials. This outcropping part, we had pumped the entire lake down to essentially, the engineers knew where the water line was and gave us survey points. So we essentially started our outcropping from down below, worked our way up to above that part. So it was about 18 inches above our water line came through, but it gave somebody, you always think about like, the little kid adventure factor, right? They want to jump on things. They want to roll along these lines. For us, for a public space, especially when you come into a place like this or a garden where kids are going to be using it, there's that sense of, I can jump from here to there. We're leaving a little bit of what I always think of as like a little oration stone, right? They can come up to this, they can make a little speech, they can get everybody's attention and jump onto that part and chase to it. So there's places like that where you can sort of integrate both materials, and certainly you can create these little opportunities with it. And with outcropping stone, you just sort of have that part because they're flat pieces. They're almost like these natural bench opportunities that you can have, that'll create. The other part, again, with gravel backfill and other things, you can create these larger parts. This was somewhere between, I don't know, I've lost the number, somewhere between 85 to 100 tons of material that was brought in to replicate the look of a natural hillside outcropping. And then this outcropping was a sitting area and kind of worked its way down from the steps. But you can certainly retain a larger volume with outcropping. I probably wouldn't try to pull this off with boulders because they get a little bit lost. Round things tend to roll downhill. That's a good way to put it. Not that they would move, but the larger slabs are going to be a lot more effective when they're linear, and outcropping is going to be more effective for that than the rounder forms will be for it. And now for something completely different. As we've talked a little bit about the natural materials, to this point, we've talked about, that we've got about a maximum of 36 inches, right? And it's sort of, they look wonderful, but we've got some restrictions on how much we can use them, right? They don't perform as much as the precast material will. And so we're going to spend a little time talking about precast retaining wall options. And the things to keep for that, I always look at it and say, like, what kind of mnemonics can we make for it? Think EPA for this one. Engineering, practical, and appearance are the three things to keep in mind when you're talking about the precast materials. From an engineering standpoint, all the things we talked about, from research, development, all of the engineering components, that all applies to the retaining wall sections and the retaining wall materials. And so just like with paving, you're going to have a manufacturer give you recommendations for a laying pattern, especially when it comes to height and backfill and geogrid requirements. There's a huge thing that's factored into the liability of how tall you can make that wall with the material specified. I'll give you one quick example. There was a client that we've since parted ways because it was sort of a little bit of a moving target. We essentially started the project and said, let's only build natural retaining walls in one little area, and those walls would be low. And we said, great, we can do that. And then eventually it grew to, let's use this specific material to build a 6-foot retaining wall. And I said, no, that would get us all sued. You can certainly build a 6-foot retaining wall, but you would be required to use a segmental wall engineer, which they weren't willing to do. And you'd also want a railing, and you'd also want to build it with a different material that's rated for building that 6-foot wall. So everything's possible, but in this case, the reality and the physics weren't lining up. So we just sort of said, let's part ways and figure something else out with it. But I say all that to say, everything about the performance of a retaining wall, it's important when it comes to flat work. It's very important when it comes to vertical work. If you've ever seen the memes or the images of retaining walls just suddenly giving way and failing, it's not really a joke to it, but it does illustrate the example of how important it is to make sure that you're specifying the right material for the right thing. Good news is every manufacturer will tell you exactly how tall you can build with their wall. And if there's an alternate and the exact construction details all within their literature, it's either on their website or it's on the handy brochure that you can get at any of the building supply centers. So we won't go into those details for it, but just know that if you see a certain material, The bigger ones that are more for instance, for this, you can see there's a little bit more to the area behind the wall. There's a key on the back and there's a hollow. These are going to perform at a higher rate than just a flat piece that's sort of laid together with friction, because friction can let go. And so we'll show you more examples of that as we go. But from an engineering standpoint, all precast stuff are engineered to perform at a specific rate. From a practical standpoint, they're great from the standpoint of, you know exactly how it's going to perform. If you put it down this, it's sort of an if then. If you install it this way, it will perform this way. If you can install a very flat base work or a base area to it, certainly you know how it's going to go. And a lot of times the square and the level of the batter is already predetermined because of the shape of the material. This material and any of the other, I would say 50% of them will have a tail on them. So if you line everything up and you just line it up to that tail, it will give you the exact batter. You don't have to worry about a batter board at that point, right? You can just put it back in and be done. You can check for a level, but you don't necessarily have to worry about that batter performance because it's already built into the material. So again, if you can work with a base course and you can stack per pattern and follow the direction, this is a wonderful material. But we fall into the appearance part of our EPA part. There's always going to be copycats and there's always going to be honest looking. And the copycats, again, just for a refresher, are the ones that try to look like natural material. And the honest looking materials are the ones that say, we're concrete, this is what we are, this is what we're going to look like. And there are a really wide range of utilitarian to more embellished rock looking ones. Everything in this image is a precast material, down to the steps, down to the wall that's here. And at a glance, it looks like natural material. When you start to look at it a little bit more closely, you start to see that the forms are just generally a little softer. And that's really the best way I can say it. When you look at it up close, you start to see the pattern. But for each of the precast retaining wall, you'll see that there's a per pallet coverage. It's really consistent because there's no waste in them. Essentially, you'll know that you're buying 28 units that have 0.66 square feet. And as long as you're using it within a certain rate, you know exactly the amount. So it's a lot more efficient when it comes to using that material from an installer standpoint. The performance rating, again, is always going to be figured out, and the parameters of use for all materials from each manufacturer are going to be called that as well. I want to give you a couple examples of just some different types, and we'll look at it in two parts, some copycats and some honest ones. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but there's a few things here that just sort of illustrate that idea of being a material that tries to look like a natural material, and a few that look like they're definitely a concrete part. In that copycat category, I'll show you BelleGarde's cast wall. This is the first one that sort of took my attention because they did a really nice job of individually dyeing each part with a faded ombre mix. So in this color, in this piece, this is one unit. And within that one unit, there's probably about a dozen to 8 to a dozen different colors that fade from one to the other in the ombre. And also the facing of it is quite nice because you can it replicates that chiseled edge look. So as we go through it, that's one of the top ones that you'll oftentimes see, BelleGarde's material in the cast stone wall. There's a lot of different face options. You have a lot of different laying course options. They have some that look like they're just each individual one course, and they have some that look like they're stacked as well. And it comes down to the range of colors and the number of different faces that you can just take and lay out in an area. It's the same functional part, but you can lay them all out and create a different effect with the different faces to them.
So it's not real stone?
That's right. Yeah. So each of these, you can see the key that's in the back here. Each of these is actually a precast face. And a little bit like we talked about in the natural materials, the precast material for paving, there's a face mix that happens on the front, say the front 2 to 3 inches. And then after that, there's a structural mix that's all blended together. And they perform at a really engineered, at a really predictable part. You can even see that on this, they're trying to do things like this to really break up the linearity and break up the unit size. So it doesn't look like, they'll give you 3 or 4 different sizes. So it doesn't look like you're creating a very regimented piece.
So where do you buy these pieces? Not at the quarries.
Yeah, so no, all of these would come from the BelleGarde manufacturer would give them to you essentially in a pallet that would have a mix of them. So you might get in the pallet, you're probably going to come up with, let's just say, for instance, a dozen of these uh, 16 of these and 24 of those based on the sizes, and they'll come pre-mixed in the actual pallet for it too. So these wouldn't be quarried at all. They'd be coming from a precast manufacturer. So at any local building supply yard, you'll be able to get that material and find it as you go. Then an additional one, Unilock's Rivercrest, is similar to that. Again, this is just one of their color ranges, but the effect is to try and give you, you'll see this area that's here as you fill it with backfill, you're filling those individual core pieces, but they're doing a pretty bang up job of breaking up what would normally look like, oh, that's a concrete wall, right? I can see the repetition shape. We'll see those in the more utilitarian ones. Some of the more decorative ones have gotten pretty far away from looking like there's a regimented pattern, and it's a little bit harder to do it. This, in fact, actually every one of these pieces, the way that Unilock did it, was every one of these pieces is an individual part. It's not that there's 3 or 4 different faces pieces. There is in this one, I think there's probably about a dozen different Unilock Rivercrest unit sizes. So from that manufacturer, they've engineered a whole bunch of those kit of parts that all fit together, and they're all interchangeable. So from this part, you get the benefit of an engineered performance. You know how it's going to react, but you also get the product or the production efficiency that it'll go down fast. One of the little cues that you'll see is oftentimes when you look at a dry stacked wall, a natural dry stack wall, you get to the top of it and you just look at it, and the Stone Trust actually has this in the recommendation. They say as you break open your pallets of material for natural stone, save a percentage of them for the capstones, so that when you get to the top of the wall, you look in and you don't see little sliver pieces, you see heavier big capstone sections of stone. And oftentimes it's basically like the field of stone just sort of continues and goes through. One of the little tells that you'll see if you're ever wondering, for something like this that looks like it's a natural material, one of the tells is that on a precast wall, you're always required to have a coping, because all the unit sizes, for the ones that look natural, all of those unit sizes actually have this on top, and it's not the finished look that you want to look as you're walking through a garden. So every one of these is going to have a coping unit that's applied and mortared in place, and as part of the installation part. So a few more copycat items. This one looks a little bit more manufactured, but it's Teco Blocks Prescott. They're trying to, when you look at it closely, again, you can kind of see a little bit of a softening to it. But again, they're trying to emulate that natural stone face of a material. And then what used to be the only thing that was out there was these utilitarian approaches, right? When someone said, oh, I just need a precast retaining wall, it was like, oh, okay, it's going to look like a parking lot. Well, that's because the only ones that were available back in the day were ones that looked like they belonged in a parking lot. There were no decorative faces. So when we look at a few of these older ones, these generally tend to be the older patterns, and they tend to be the ones that are engineered. You'll see a cross section of these in one of the other pictures coming up. But each one of these is shaped like a key, and those keys then have a tail that fit back in. They're all filled with gravel and grid. They're generally for heavier vertical applications and for building much taller walls. It doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, have much of a place, although the house that we moved into has 2 walls still remaining that are those utilitarian approach walls, but they don't really have that same dressed and residential feel to them. They feel a little bit more commercial. There's a little bit more of a no frills feeling to them. And oftentimes what you'll see in these is the detailing of them that we won't go into for here is that they're used with a geogrid. And the geogrid is just a fabric that's laid in between some of these courses, and it's laid back into the backfill to give it some additional strength as it goes. So again, everything about precast is engineering. And in this case, it starts to show, right? In the other ones, they become a little bit more artistic.
Hey, Greg, I just have a question.
Yeah.
When considering like the price point for these walls, I would assume natural is always more expensive, but when you look at like the more unique ones, like the Unilock, where there's so many unique faces, does it start to get close to how much natural?
You're exactly right. It's a good point. Yeah, because so sometimes, and a little bit of it'll depend. I've always enjoyed the fact that we have a farmer next to our lot. We have some land, and we're on really good terms with the farmer. So they've been on their land for, and I'm saying this to make a point, not to ramble, I promise. But our farmer neighbor has said at any time they've been on their land for like 6, I think, or 7 generations, and they've been amassing and collecting and taking fieldstone out of the fields and putting them in a pile for the last 250 years. And basically, we've gotten free access to it every time we wanted to build it. So the natural material, the point that I'm making with it is the proximity to the quarry and the level of manufacturing that goes into it. If you're buying a material and a natural stone that's real close to the point source of the origin, and it's going right to a manufacturer, to an outlet, or you can get it or you could buy it like direct and close to the quarry, you're not paying for exorbitant shipping prices, and essentially you're buying it at a pretty good rate. Now, the flip side of that is if you've got to bring something in, I did one project in the Midwest where we brought stone in that you'll see later. The stone was brought in from a quarry that supplied Martha's Vineyard. So we bought that stone on the East Coast through Rhode Island. We brought it all the way into Chicagoland and we installed it there. And it was an expensive material because it was granite and it was difficult to work with, but we also trucked it halfway across the country. So I say that to say the price points get pretty close when you have depending on the trucking sizes and depending on the product and how much it's handled to it. Generally, natural materials are a little bit more on the expensive side because of the labor that goes into the quarry labor tends to be a little bit more on the expensive side for the equipment and manufacturing it out of the ground and harvesting it. And some of what I'll say the utilitarian ones are pretty low in price point, but it does get pretty close. Like if I went back to this image, there we go. You'll start to see this face footage goes up pretty high, pretty close in price. So you might not be really saving a lot when you get to some of those when you're doing it, but you might be gaining a lot in terms of performance. Is that a fair way to answer?
Yeah, and I guess if you live like in a very secluded area, not near a quarry, then it just probably is more feasible to do like the precast. Or I'm just trying to think like, why would you pick precast over natural?
I ask myself that question every day, and yeah, I mean, I'll say from a preference standpoint, from a design part, from an aesthetics part, unless there's a really good reason. I've had a couple of existing stone walls that were here that the previous homeowner left us. I faced them with natural stone because I don't like the look of it. Mm-hmm. Really, the reason why you would do it is if you have an area that has to have the performance and you have to build that and get that strength part of it up. That's one part. Cost tends to factor in, and the other part of it is sometimes the skill level of the people that are applying it. It can be challenging to find somebody that's going to want to build a 3-foot drywall or even touch drywall material depending on your area. Mm-hmm. If you have masons that are just looking to get one job in, or a landscape company that's looking to just ram in one job and get to the next and get to the next, they might not want to park at a project and park at a job because they think they might scare somebody off with the price of a natural stone wall. So.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. So a few more utilitarian ones, the Unilock Pisa series, smaller units, they almost look like they're coping parts. Again, they can kind of be stacked into it. And then when you start getting into the, what I would call the kind of the honest modern one, we talked earlier about that job where we parted ways and said, I don't really want to risk trying to build a wall that's 6 feet tall. This was the material. And if you look at this, the unit size is not terribly bad, but there's no pin, there's nothing but friction to hold this material. And even if someone were to say that they were going to, use the adhesive or a caulk to hold it in place or sort of close it together, really you need one good freeze thaw surface or cycle to really break that friction, and then a wall is going to fail. And so, what I ended up suggesting was a similar, I think it was a similar Teco or Unilock product that had the same face, but it had a different makeup that was able to fulfill it. And then I recommended somebody that just did retaining walls, and that's what we ended up going with. But again, it just when you look at this material, oftentimes you'll see in the fine print, this wall can be built up to 30 inches, and it's just they're conservative to that point, but no one really wants a project to fail, and nobody wants anybody to get hurt. So there's good reasons for why they put things to it. And obviously, if you're going through that investment of time, effort, and energy, you want your project to hold up and you want it to survive and look well for it. So a few more of the other materials. This is Belgard's Melville. It can be installed sort of flat. It can be done in sort of a staggered piece to it. This one was a little bit more interesting from Teco's part. If people had seen, you asked about dead men earlier, and these horizontal pieces that go here are actually installed back into the wall. And so what you'd see is the face end. This is a product that essentially is made to look like wood grain and made to almost emulate a timber wall. It can be used, and there's a product line in Borealis that will emulate the look of a plank flooring. And it also has that, which can be used in curbing, or it can be used in retaining walls as well. Not as much of a huge fan of it in the walls because it's sort of narrow and you can really have just limited opportunities, but the paving actually has a nice material to it as well. But again, every project has the right parameters and you can always find the right material for it. And then this is one where it's, again, a little bit on the modern side, but these are some of the companies that look at it and say, we don't have to look like stone. I mean, you want stone? We've got another product for it, but you can also find a material that looks like concrete, and maybe that's the aesthetic of the house and the property and the design. You don't necessarily have to just copy and say, well, we have a wall. Walls have always looked like stone, so we need to make concrete look like stone. You can make this in such a way that, and this just sort of illustrates that point on the in the nth degree. A few other product types that go through there on the manufactured part, and this gets into the coping side. The coping that's on here is the cap of the wall, right? So you have the wall material that goes up. This is that cast stone. Actually, I'm sorry. This is a veneer wall that was a cultured stone veneer, and then it was capped with a Lampus Rosetta dimensional coping that was intended to look like an actual stone coping. And oftentimes you'll find now there's sort of a crossover. Some of the manufacturers are actually using cast limestone. So they're using recast limestone and they're pouring them in such a way, then having a broken edge so that it still gives you the look. Essentially, you're reconstituting limestone. So it's a little bit like if you were to buy orange juice in the old frozen container and reconstitute it and add water. That's a little bit of what these are doing. You're just adding, you're reconstituting limestone fines and creating a manufactured limestone for the product. So there's a few of these. There are some sourcing, especially in these products, there can be a little bit more sourcing and cost benefits because they're really predictable. But again, depending on the one, you can recut the limestone ones and it'll be just fine. You can't really recast these because the inside surface mix is going to look like a broken piece of concrete. So you really have to think forward as to what your end dimensions are going to be before you start to shape them, if you're going to make changes with it. Few other examples just from the manufactured part, and this gets into the step category, just like the walls are all manufactured here. This is R.I. Lampus. They're also a Pennsylvania company. If you haven't figured it out, I tend to give preference in some of those to some of the Pennsylvania-based ones because they are locally based and they support, not only they support our economy, they're also local. So a lot of our supply places carry them without huge amounts of trucking. You're not bringing this in from the other end of the country. So the price point tends to be a little bit easier for them. So the rectilinear slab steps, you'll see the rectilinear in this one, you'll see an irregular step in the next image. And this just gives you a it's a little bit more casual than a cut step, but essentially it tries to give you that look of a snap edge step from natural material. The nice part about the steps, and I think a reason why, back to one of the reasons why people will like the stairs essentially is because they're exactly graded to the right height. So not only can you predict your grade, if you're going to figure out that you have 15 feet of run at 2% pitch, and then you're going to have 8 7-inch steps, you can predict exactly where you're going to hit. When you get down to natural stone, sometimes it's a challenge because you might have one that's 5 7/8. You might have one that's 6 1/8. And it might not average out to the same amount of uniform stairs. And so certainly there's a production part when you get into the manufactured stair systems that are there. So I'll show you that, as well as this would be Lampus's. You'll sometimes see the name Rosetta called out, or Rosetta stone. That's one that's actually bought. People will buy the rights to reproduce the Rosetta product. And so Lampus will have one. You'll see other companies making a Rosetta line. And we've seen this image before, but whereas the other one before was a uniform linear, they go from about 6 feet wide to 4 feet wide. These ones are just a little narrower and another option. So it's
Lampus is a name of a company.
Lampus is the name. Yeah, RI Lampus is the name of the company. Yeah, RI. It's actually somebody's last. Lampus is the last name. I think it was the founder's name for it. But you'll see the outcropping pieces. You can blend the stairs into the walls a little bit, and it's a good large format for something predictable and a little bit more organic size to it. So again, from some additional resources part, we're going to look at this slide, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break. I'm listening to the thunder build behind me, so if you hear it on my end, it's coming up on ours, and hopefully we'll be in good shape. But the precast retaining wall options, a few good resources. Again, always look at your local material yard and find. What I've often done is walk the yard. I'll go take photographs, take notes of what's there, and then stop into the office. And generally, I've never gone into a material yard where they haven't had the flyers and essentially the material product line. You get so much information with those. I oftentimes will go and just have, I think I have some that are just even in an old binder for product lines that are still there. But every so often you can go collect some of the additional information. There's a lot more of what you see there. And if you see that product and know what it is in the yard, you can get the product literature from inside the local material yard. And then you'll be able to find out a little bit more about the performance ratings for them. So good. There's the other names that were here too. Unilock is one. RI Lampus was the other. Belgard just got bought out by, I can never remember the name of them, but they've since I've known them. One of my neighbors is a rep for Belgard, and they've been owned now by I think 3 different companies that you keep getting eaten up by bigger and bigger companies, but they keep that product line because there's so much product love for the product in the industry for them. And then Techo Block is the other one for it as well. So I think with that, let's take 5 minutes, and just when we come back, we'll finish up with retaining walls, but we're going to look at block and veneer walls, and we'll look at garden structures as an overview after that. We'll give you some more examples of it, and then we'll hear from there. So let's take 5 minutes and we'll wrap it back up. All right, we're going to get back into it here with block and veneer walls, and then we're going to do a little bit on garden structures. That's going to be a little bit more of a show and tell part. But when we talk about block and veneer walls, there's a couple different terms that you'll hear for it. Masonry and wet masonry, because the ease of installing it is so easy. Lick and stick is one of the weird terms that you'll hear it, because it's a small gauge stuff. You can just put on a thin mastic on the back end of it, and then it applies right to it, and there's really nothing that needs to hold itself back in place. So when you're talking about block and veneer walls, really anything is possible. It tends to be a blending of traditional building and landscape construction. So if you can think of it, if you can imagine it, if you can engineer it, you can build it. And it requires a lot of excavation and some skilled masonry trades. It requires oftentimes engineering and stamp drawings to it too. And so this is not going to be an exhaustive look, but it's going to be a little bit more of an overview as we go through it. The skilled trades, the people that you're going to work with in this part of it, have long-term experience. They have very full schedules. We did a project that we designed this winter, and we're breaking ground with it in 2 weeks. And it was based on the Mason schedule. We knew that we didn't want to rip it up before the 4th of July. So we basically looked at everybody's schedule and said, we're going to build it all around the Mason schedule. And then, we backtracked from there and built out our Gantt that way. But you're working with people that are bringing in a technical and specialized ability for it too. The two types of block and veneer walls are going to be two different parts. Generally, if you're working with a natural material, it's going to be a full 4-inch veneer. So it's a thick actual piece of stone, and it's set on a foundation and sort of blocked up. So you'll see the actual real material. And then there's also a thin veneer, and that's usually 1.5 to 2 inches, even with the mastic on the back of it. Think of that as being like a tile applied to a concrete block wall. So the three things to kind of keep in mind as you're looking through this is the main components that you'll see in all of these block and veneer walls. There are 2 parts. These 2 are interchangeable. You're always going to have a foundation, and that's a footer pad that's poured and rebarred and concreted in place. Again, not to go too far into the weeds with that one, but that's essentially down below frost line, and to make sure your wall doesn't move, because everything here is fixed and mortared in place. So when it's fixed and mortared in place, you want to make sure it doesn't break, doesn't move, and that freeze thaw doesn't affect it. And then you'll have an option for this vertical piece. The footer or foundation will be on the bottom. Above that, you'll have a CMU block or a poured wall. And the CMU, essentially concrete masonry unit, it's either hollow core or it's filled concrete block that's filled up. And that's either going to be the vertical piece that's your base, or it's going to be a poured wall that's formed and poured in place. It's stronger, but you go back to our price point conversation, it's definitely more costly. And then something you'll see in all of these, you'll kind of get a little glimpse of it. We have a few pieces of pipe that's here. There's some PVC pipe that's dewatering that as well. So I'll give you some examples, and we're really just going to look more at some of the examples for this part of it. Block and veneer walls, you'll look at a couple different pieces of it, and it's a selection of the veneer. The veneer is that face material, and it's a little bit more decorative and dressed, but that veneer material is going to be what's facing the CMU. So that could be brick, that could be stone, that could be cultured, but that's the the term we would have for the visible stonework and the pattern that we would see on top of here. And then you'll see a coping in this image, in this outdoor kitchen that we did years ago. The coping is actually just a granite countertop that was on here, but there's a decorative purpose for it, and there's also a practical purpose. And the practical purpose is the more important of the two. The decorative, certainly it's nice to look at a coping, and that can be a complementary or contrasting part, but you want to make sure that water is not getting down between the concrete block and the veneer, because once that does it, again, water is sort of our enemy outdoors. If water seeps between those two and it freezes, it's going to start to blow apart when we get into our freeze thaw cycle. So there are some coping free walls that I'll show you examples of that are designed to shed water from the top, but not have a coping on it. And certainly that's something that the rate mason can do as well. We've talked to a couple that can do that. And then the mortar joints is the last term that we would just have in terms of the block and veneer. And the mortar joints are those visible joints between the individual pieces. And those can have a tile to them. There's a lot of different profiles and such to it. Just wanted to give you a couple examples as we look through that. And then we'll spend some time in a few just looking at garden structures. But the block and veneer walls, there's a couple examples here. One of the great parts about using this, if you can, and if the design budget and everything else allows for this, is if you can use the exact same material on the building and extrude it and bring it out into the landscape. And so you can start to build a sense of this, essentially a dialogue or a vocabulary of the same materials being used on the building as well as in the landscape. So it's a great way to do repetition of materials. In this case, it was a limestone veneer. We had a clay tile, not a Spanish clay tile, but an old and historic clay tiles roof that we had used some pieces for here. And then just a CNC fabricated steel house number for it. But again, opportunities to use the same material, the same mortar pattern, and let your landscape details feel like they belong to the house, not just a little bit more bespoke way to go, but certainly some other opportunities. We talked about how you can have a coping-free wall, and this has a little bit more batter onto it. This was just a material that was intended. We took larger pieces essentially and shaped them a little bit so that they spread water off the top and did not require a coping. But you can certainly do a wall along those lines as well with a coping-free wall. With antique clay street pavers, certainly it's a little bit more of an unusual use or an unusual application for them. But in this case, it was an antique clay street paver that was used as an outdoor fireplace with some limestone accents. And then that sort of was repeated. We used antique clay street pavers as a curbing. We used cast limestone and tried to repeat those materials in top. One thing I'll just note is that you can also do some poured concrete copings as well, because the top piece that was here was such a large piece that we poured it in place and lifted it for the chimney cap. We've already seen this image, but just sort of illustrates the idea of using thin set brick veneer to match the home. Certainly some of the things you do outside with granite countertops can be used. In this instance, something is using a limestone corbel support so that you've got some structure and a way to support the overhang. And then on this material, this gets a little bit ahead of ourselves into the structures, but we've got a cedar canopy, and then there's an awning top that's not shown. That's this umbrella fabric that's seasonally put on top of this outdoor kitchen for it. Almost hate to say what the outdoor kitchen cost at that time, but a few more block and veneer examples. I'll show you the one from Martha's Vineyard in a moment, but the Pennsylvania fieldstone material can be used with what's called a deep raked joint, so that you really don't see the joint between it. You don't see the mortar bed, you see the stone material as a result. And this has a bullnose bluestone coping. So we start to see some of the materials that we've seen in paving and in retaining walls. In these block and veneer examples, a lot of these things start to come together, and you're like, oh, I've seen that before. Now we're repeating and reusing some of these together with it as well.
Greg, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? So behind that fieldstone veneer, is that like a concrete block, like a basic block?
Yep. So behind this, actually, this was built with fiberglass and a natural gas diffuser. So
Yeah.
it's a natural gas line that runs to it. If it wasn't, and if it was a open flame, and if the flame was down and exposed to the heat, we would likely have put a fire brick on that part of it. Because this didn't have that, and the gas was actually up above, there's fiberglass here, and behind this is a concrete masonry unit and then capped. So essentially you have the structural material behind it and then the facing material outside of it.
So it's a regular old concrete brick. I mean, block, like a big one.
Yeah, a regular, an 8x16 CMU. Yeah.
Yeah, because I went by a job the other day and I saw this whole thing happening, just like what you're talking. I was like amazed. I had to take a picture of it. I was like, wow, that's what that looks like underneath.
Yeah. We'll see it as some examples of it in session 4. There's actually,
good.
We have some construction examples of just things that are ripped up and look, terrible because they're under construction, right? You're looking at it like almost the worst possible time to look at a project, but it's because they haven't really gotten to that step yet. So all that infrastructure prep work hasn't gotten there yet to it.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. Thanks so much. Yep.
Sure. No
Thank
problem.
you.
Yep. Not a problem. This was the one, this was a project that was located in the Midwest, but we brought in all East Coast materials. This family vacationed on Martha's Vineyard every year. And when I found that out, we were able to, I actually, at that time, I was also taking a trip to Martha's Vineyard. So we found the same supplier and we were able to bring in the same split face granite. We were able to do do some other material things for it. But again, it just goes to show, with the budget piece of it being what it is, I mean, certainly people can spend a lot on whatever they want to spend a lot on. This made sense because they were trying to do a staycation home for it, and they wanted to bring in the materials that were important to them for that piece. So coping free wall again. And we just tried to replicate basically my vacation photos from Martha's Vineyard that happened to be from that same part. And we said, you want to look like this? We'll make it look like this. And everybody went home happy at the end of the day.
How much would a project like that cost to make?
I want to say this was a couple of years ago. I think the total backyard for this one was probably in the neighborhood of like 350 to 400,000. I think that was probably the range, and that would have probably been the pool, but that goes back 15 years ago, maybe.
So now you're saying it would be like double.
So I would say probably now, I mean, it was a larger backyard. You're only seeing a piece of it, but I would guess you'd probably be in like the 6s, and it would be just a gut check for them now if it's all natural material. A few other examples for it, just to illustrate again. Doesn't have to be a big fancy house for it. We have a very modest home, and we tried to repeat the same materials because we have a little quarriette on our property that we sort of reused it for. But in this case, same brick. It was new construction, so we knew where to get the brick. We knew where to get the limestone. We were able to use cast limestone planters from Long Shadow. This is a wonderful company in Southern Illinois that they build beautiful, beautiful urns that they'll ship anywhere. Wonderful people, wonderful customer service. But we were able to try and just say, like, okay, if we wanted to extend this house out into the landscape and make it connect, how do we do that? And we're able to just, when you work with some of those block and veneer examples, the details are fun. You can kind of, you can start to get into it a little bit more and get a little bit more level of depth to it. I'm going to switch gears and spend a little bit of time talking about garden structures and give it some overviews. The specialty structures that we'll talk about for just as we close up today are really fall into 2 categories. It's a fun part for me because I work on a lot of structure things every day. Today I got to design the last details of an illustration of a solar kiln, and I was like, I didn't think I'd be drawing a solar kiln today, but there it was. The specialty structures are fun because they bring in some the structural things that people can really have, like from an emotive standpoint. They're these tactile things that everybody really responds to. They're the things that make a place memorable. And I'll just give you a really dumb way to remember it. And if you remember it, great. My little chicken at the bottom says it would be the acronym, some things remain unforgettable because they're unusual, really exciting, and spectacular. And that would spell structures, because they make a place that's a little bit more interesting and exciting, and they make a place that could just be sort of natural and even, and they can be the more memorable part to it. We're going to look at prefabricated things that you can buy off the shelf and just put in. And we're also going to look at things that could be completely customized that might require engineering to it. I'm happy to work with both, and either they're both great. I spend a little bit more time in the custom things doing it. And what I've said to a lot of folks and what I've worked on with folks is the 80-20 rule really applies with this. What I would say is when you're working with a structure, either design 80% of it and let an expert take the other 20 and engineer it, or design 20% of it and let the expert do the 80% of it. Don't go 50-50 because no one will have ownership of it. But for instance, what I'll say is it's a very collaborative process when you work on a garden structure, and it's best to be open to change, be open-ended, because you're partnering with a person that's a fabricator, you're partnering with somebody that has the installation part of it. There might be shop drawings, and new information will always come up as you're working with it. And a lot of times you'll see something and you'll go, oh, I like this idea, but that idea will have another iteration, or it might take a little bit of a better path. Doesn't matter who it is. Everybody I've worked with along the way always has a little bit of an input. And most times the projects get better when the input's there. So again, what I would say is just be open and just know that if you give someone the seed of an idea and you're giving that 20% and say, hey, I want a building that, I want a pool house or I want a pavilion, right? Give them that idea and let a person run with it, or be really, really controlled with it and say, this is generally what I want. I might not have all the ins and outs of it. Can you give it a final pass? And just work back and forth with it that way. That tends to be the most helpful as you go through working with garden structures. From a boring slide standpoint, we have just a couple here. There's some vertical specialties, and those would be things like garden gates and driveway gates and fences and wall trellises, et cetera. Garden and address posts, we'll look at some of those. And then there's overhead structures. The three things that you'll oftentimes see is an arbor. It's basically a small scale thing that's open air, but it's a small scale pass through that accentuates a gateway. You'll see a pergola, which is still open air, but a little larger scale. And then a pavilion, which is open air, but it's got a roof on it. And a lot of times people early on will look at it and they'll say pavilion when they mean pergola, but pergola and pavilion are really the two common ones. Pergola, basically no roof. Pavilion's got a roof. Just know that the more roof and the more structure you put ahead of you, the more engineering and checks that you'll have. The forces that always work on your overhead structures with a roof are going to be the things that I always end up writing last on my shop drawings. And those are, you have to make sure it's rated for your dead load, wind load, snow load, and exposure class. We don't get into live load, or that's more for habitable structures, but just know that the more complex it is with a roof, the more it's going to act like an airplane wing or a sail, and it's going to want to take off when really heavy winds go. So if it's open like a pergola and it's just beams, wind will pass right through that, and nobody's at the worst if a windstorm comes up. But if it's got a roof, it's going to be like an umbrella on a windy day. It's going to want to pull out. So all those forces have to be figured out. So again, for the health, safety, and welfare of the people that are working on it. A couple other little things that are come into, this actually will kind of go into the realm of, garden structures we'll touch on, to porches and decks and screen rooms. Those are the ones that are attached to a building. But then you also have standalone structures like a pavilion or a pool house, or some of the multi-use sheds that became popular for a little bit of time during the COVID years, where people just were like, they wanted a little getaway or a home office part. Sometimes those little getaway studios are popular and can be fun, little different things to help make it design a little bit more different. So from this part, I also oftentimes we'll look at it, we'll see examples next, but the last part of the boring slide here would be, thinking about the resources of what these garden structures will require. They're heavy, they're cumbersome, they require equipment oftentimes. I have a good friend who, I think my pavilion is in here. I made the pavilion on the ground and basically made everything on the ground and built it on sawhorses. Then I stacked it and set aside, but I needed a builder's help to put it up. There was no way I could do it myself with just myself. So, we had, I called in some help for somebody that was a builder that helped do the part that he was very good at as well. The prefabrication building installers, you can find resources where you can just buy exactly what it is and it'll come to you with a kit of parts and a shipping list. And then two other things just to be aware of, the more complex the structure becomes, the more you really want to check into zoning ordinances to make sure that you can, or your township says that you can, and things like impermeable surfaces. root lot coverage and number of buildings, depending again on your municipality. Those things
Do you
might
need like zoning ordinances for pergolas and like,
depends on your municipality, but basically, if you look at it, some people will call it a structure. Some people will call it a temporary structure. Really depends on how your zoning ordinance is written. And when in doubt, I don't know. I guess I've built a couple things on my own property, and we just had the zoning reviewer come through, and they bumped up our tax bracket because I've improved a few things that were on here, and the reason was structure improvements. And I was like, well, I couldn't live with the things that were here with it. When in doubt, kind of look through your zoning ordinance, make sure, because the biggie is like zoning is really the stickler, engineering is really the safety check, and those two things work hand in hand. So I never really want to downplay them from the standpoint of they're there because there's checks and balances on people that would take shortcuts, and it's a good way to just basically have a check before something falls down, especially on the engineering side. So a couple examples for these, and I just wanted to run through these and just show more than talk about some of them. An address signposts, this was a combination of a pre-manufactured signpost that we purchased from Walpole Woodworkers, and then we built a custom bracket. So we had to know some of the specs and the other parts to make sure the two things went together. And that was just, even in terms of planning out where the utility line's going to run so that we could switch it from inside the house. Back in the days when people used light switches and not Bluetooth to turn lights on and off. Another just, sometimes they can be very little simple things like a utility screen. We had built this one previous to the municipality shipping out much taller garbage cans. So we were like, oh, great. The garbage cans of this part are, they're like 30 inches tall, and people had like 2 or 3 of them. Well, like 2 years after this was built, the municipality got a new garbage vendor, and they came out with these like 4-foot tall ones. So it was, you plan for as much as you can, but the idea being that a utility screen can sometimes be a very simple way to not have to look at the garbage cans, to not have to look at the air conditioning units or the heat condensers that are there. And this was just right after installation. It's actually a combination of a pressure treated post and a hemlock stained section of panels that go through it. You can get very, you can go to the sky's the limit. Somebody with a CNC machine once told me, he was a smoker, so he had a really deep raspy voice, and he goes, my CNC machine doesn't care what shape you make it. He goes, I can make it anything you want. And I was like, okay, game on. So we had really fun working together with that person. In this case, it was a combination of steel and also timber. And so steel and timber can sometimes hold each other together, and they can sometimes work together with it. And this was a very customized entry gate. On a smaller scale, this was all, everybody can see in the upper left, this is all, very custom steel hardware with timbers. On the right, this was off-the-shelf hardware, so it doesn't have to be something super custom. It could be a combination of using off-the-shelf hardware and timber that works and creating your own details with it. And again, just other pieces. There's always planning that goes into it to make sure that your structures go together right. And then again, in cases like this, where you're running an electric line up through into something, it actually happens here. This is this light fixture, but just making sure that those things are planned ahead for in those respects. And then even things like iron arbors and gate accents, certainly with working with radiuses, if you can draw it in CAD, you can find somebody to build it. I've been very fortunate to find a couple really amazing manufacturers, both in the Midwest and here, that can build anything in metal. They could build anything out of timber. They could build anything out of wood. So, even down to like, a customizable accent for something like an address plaque to it. And then from a pergola example, you'll see, oftentimes people think about pergolas as just being, they have to be a certain way, right? With decorative end cuts, and they have to be built a certain way. This was a little bit more modern feeling to it. This one was built with a house that was a little bit more streamlined, and this was conceptually a similar idea for it. But, to control the force of racking, all we had was a 90-degree custom steel bracket that was real tall. That was really minimalistic. It worked with the aesthetic of the home. So you don't necessarily have to be tied into something as traditional looking as this. Even this is a traditional pergola structure. still has some steel plate brackets, has a little bit more, efficient or modern end cuts to it, and can be built in such a way that it still is attractive. Some different examples of just open air pergola structures that are there. And then when we get down to the timber frame pavilion level, there's a couple examples here, but this was built just as a family getaway, and it was a spot that was about an hour north of where I live into north central Pennsylvania. And the homeowners had purchased land that was near their family for a long time. They had the idea of building a retirement home and building a space that was there. Before they built the actual house, they built a timber frame pavilion that was created in such a way that it got them up out of the weeds, gave them a screened area. There's actually, can't really see it on this back section here, but it was an area that was all lockable. So you could you could winterize it and then create this structure. And then on a smaller basis, a timber frame pavilion. This is a freestanding one that's just a set of hemlock queen posts, trusses, and very similar in scale, but now it's the same idea, but it's attached to the actual house. So in this case, that porch and this pavilion share a lot of the same features, but because one's anchored to a house and one's freestanding, they fall under a little bit of a different rate. And again, a lot of it can be built in a shop and then taken out to the site. The final installation and assembly goes there. But the more work that someone can do in a shop, the less work that you're doing out on a job site to make sure it all goes together. And certainly combinations of steel and things along those lines. When that CNC manufacturer, the steel manufacturer, had said they didn't really care what the steel looked like, it was like, well, how big can I make it? And they were like, whatever you want. So it was kind of nice to be able to just draw and be creative with things and sketch stuff and then put them into CAD and then work with giving people the plate files to it. And even this is just an open air cabana pavilion with a wood frame and just this umbrella awning top on top of it. So a few things here. We'll wrap up on time tonight with it. Few additional resources. Walpole Woodworkers is a great resource if people are looking for some great resources that are shipped to you. Certainly you can see the prices, you can see everything, so that nothing's really unpredictable with them. But they'll find you beautiful East Coast versions of gates and overhead canopies and structures. At that point, you really just need to know how to find somebody to put it together or be ready to take delivery of it and have the equipment to put it together. And then also Pennsylvania Sawmill Company is a company I've worked with years or 4 years rather. And they do the examples that we saw here have all kind of come through their shop of heavy timber, and they have a lot of design resources for it as well. And again, feel free to stick around if you have any questions for it. From a section summary standpoint and kind of wrap up, the thing to keep in mind is as we talk about retaining wall materials, if I were to look at one big thing, those retaining wall materials can range from very, very simple, basically just leftover cut stone that's very lightly manufactured, to things that go to the nth degree and touch base on a lot of construction methods. So they can be very simple, they can be very complex, and there's a lot of range within them, within natural materials and within manufactured products. Really, anything is possible when it comes to creating an outdoor space. It really comes down to two things. If you can imagine it and you can get the right people together to create a team, I'll just say this touches into my last point for tonight. It's great to collaborate with an expert that knows what they're doing with it. The project that we're going to break ground in a couple of weeks, if we have time and during session 4, I'm happy to share some additional renderings of it. But when it came down to it, the homeowner had hired me to do the design work for it. But if it stays on a piece of paper, it's just a piece of paper. I mean, there's really nothing to it. And if you can spend some time getting to know people that are the experts that can build the stuff with it, or if you yourself are an expert that can build it, it's wonderful to find it. We found the best mason in the area, and they were up on for it. We found an exceptional builder that's going to project manage and sort of general the project. He'll take care of the things like the electrical, the gas lines, all the foundation things, and build the timber frame that's going up with it. And then we got a great landscape contractor that's going to do our water feature and the other parts. If it weren't for those folks, I'd draw a pretty picture all day, but we can't live in a piece of paper. We can't live and spend time in the things that you draw. they're nice to get the design across, and I can't take one away from the other. But when in doubt, find those people that are there, build those relationships. I've had good relationships with landscapers on this project I've only known for about a year. The builder I've known for 8 years, and we're close, close with one another. And the mason I've known for about 4 or 5 years. So it's really good to have those relationships when you can. And with that, I'm just going to wrap it up. We'll have a game over for today. Tomorrow, or sorry, on session 4, we'll get together and look at the design challenge, and we'll also spend a little bit of time looking at some of the other structural pieces. We'll look at some construction details, and we'll kind of wrap it up on session 4. So if anybody has a chance and they want to get the design things, the sooner they put them together, the more likely I'll be able to kind of pepper them into the last PowerPoint part. And again, we'll review the thing. What I'm careful to say is the design solution that I'll show is not the right one. It's the one that they bought. So I know there's a lot of other options that are out there too. So if anybody has any questions, feel free. Otherwise, I'll hang out for a few.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hi. For the pavilion, I only seem to see wooden roofs. Is there an option there, like to make it type of a greenhouse or clear roof to make a pavilion, or is it?
Yeah, for sure. There's different parts for it. I think probably the examples that were there were done mostly for having shade and getting out of the heat. They're not insulated, so you really have to rely on the sun bouncing off the height and getting back out of it. But yeah, I mean, actually, I don't have images of it, but one of the last structures that I designed was a greenhouse attached to a house. The homeowner had ripped off a deck that was just, it was a deck that was, I don't know, probably almost 30 years old. And it was built poorly to begin with. It was fallen down. So the right solution for them was to build a greenhouse room where they could walk out of their basement level. And the homeowner at that point said, he goes, I have one thing. He goes, I really want to be able on like kind of a chilly day, early or late in the season. He goes, I'd like to be able to come out here, read a book, and take a nap in the sun. And so we made sure that was we use some clear Lexan panels, and we just basically built a greenhouse-like structure together for it. But I think
it's open on one side, right? It's not a greenhouse.
It was enclosed on all sides, and it was so it was enclosed on all sides with an operable door. We put some windows into it because we knew it could potentially get pretty hot pretty quick. But any of the pavilions that you saw out of there, you could just as easily put a clear roof on, as long as it's rated and it's secured in place. Some of those pieces tend to be pretty thin, so you just really want to work backwards from the structure of the roof and design a structure that's appropriate for it.
And I have a couple of follow-up questions. So some of these ideas are once in a lifetime things for us. So how would you advise to find those great landscapers and the great, other than word of mouth, because it's we don't build as many, right? I'm going to have one pavilion built in my lifetime. So
sure.
What is the best way to find people like you and their trade at their best?
It really depends on the area that you're in. I mean, I guess I was a little bit surprised when I came to central Pennsylvania. Not to go too far on a tangent for my part, but my journey to get to where I am today started, I took a job out of school with a company that we worked really long hours. It was really difficult. It was probably the worst culture I've ever had in my life. I worked at a place that they screamed their feedback at us. And I spent, all told there, I spent 5 years at their studio, but I gained 10 years of experience because it was such accelerated learning. And so then I moved around to a couple different companies there. And as I went, I sort of tried to amass my, there's a great book by Albert Brooks. It's called From Strength to Strength. And they talk about the difference between the wisdom that you get, or the knowledge that you get early on in life. And that's called fluid knowledge. And that's the stuff that you sort of like amass that's task-based. But eventually, as you get older, it becomes crystalline knowledge. And it sort of equates more into wisdom. So you find people that have been around a little bit. What I was surprised with was when I came to I worked in the Chicago area where people had, they were CFOs, they were CEOs. I worked for a number of people that just had the means to be able to do whatever they wanted. And that was wonderful, but it was a little frustrating when I came back to central Pennsylvania because the scope and the style of project was a little bit more reserved. And so I sort of just started to look in different areas, and I basically just sort of like re-upped and looked at it, opportunities to find different, find different work, so that I could get my creative, wiggles out, so to speak. So what I found is that a lot of it is dependent upon your market. If you're in a market where people have the creativity and there's a high density concentration of really creative designers, do Google searches, do looks. If you find a project in a site and you can ask somebody, go onto the areas where you can look at it. I've even found that people even on social media will find, I found some really good people that I know to this day through Instagram. I found a great CNC manufacturer and somebody else because I was in my area and I started to Google terms or search terms that were on Instagram, and a whole bunch of companies popped up, and I went, oh, I got to find out more about these folks. So that's another part of it. And certainly word of mouth. I mean, just finding people online and word of mouth. But you start to look at those, and then, as you build a basket of options, what I would say is, you start to look at those parts and maybe interview folks, find out what they've done, try to find the right things. I'll say this from experience, just because a person's creative doesn't mean you want to work with them. And probably 2 or 3 of the worst monsters, like evil monster human beings I've ever worked with, were the most creative people I'd ever known. And I would never work with them again. You couldn't pay me to work with them again. They had creativity that was like to the ends of the earth, but they were just terrible to work with. And so there's that balance of trying to find the right person that also is willing to listen to you, willing to help you, willing to extrapolate. So, from a designer standpoint, you want to find a good company that will help execute your plan. From a client standpoint, you want to find a good person that can help to help understand and realize your vision without trying to impose theirs on it. So,
thank you. I have to be careful not to become evil as I get more creative, huh?
I hope not. I don't know. I guess I would say this, the people that I work with that were so miserable, that were just the worst people that I would never want to work with again, they actually did something opposite to me. I realized at that point that life's too short, and I never wanted to make people feel that way. And so what I generally tried to do, in all sincerity, was I tried to go the extra, try to flip that over and say, I remember being in that position and being made to feel that way. What I would rather do is leave good in my wake, and not rotten things. So it can motivate you to do other things as well.
Well, you're doing that with this class. Thank you very much.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Good attitude.
Thank you. See you next
You're
time.
welcome. Okay.
I have a quick
Greg,
question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to help. So, like I said, anybody that wants to stay on, I'm happy to stay on for it.
Yeah, I have a quick question too. In terms of the design challenge, can you speak a little bit more about what your expectations are? Because I guess the focus is mostly on the hardscape, not necessarily the plant material.
Sure.
And so do you want us to label the drawings in terms of our suggestions are for the hardscape? We're using natural materials, are we using concrete, all that kind of stuff?
Sure. So I
Yeah.
would say this, you can certainly add a layer to it with the planting part of it. And I think that's excellent, because to me, the planting part helps to continue to develop what you're trying to do already with the framework and the hardscape part. But what I would say is the hardscape emphasis, obviously I'm not giving you a full set of site plans, a full set of photos, everything else to it. I'm trying to leave it intentionally a little bit more open-ended. But as you look through things, look at it and say, what are the things I'm responding to in the limited site renderings or the limited site data that's there, or the description? I wrote a few things in the narrative. And then feel free to even, send a paragraph back along with it and say, as I looked at this, I realized that it was a linear, like for instance, right? This isn't the part. I'll tell you my reaction to it was a very linear home. I guess I feel like I had intimate knowledge of it because I was able to design and work with the house part of it, but I had a chance to know what the homeowners were trying to look for. But in a normal time, if I was handed something like that, I would look at it and say, I don't know, here's something that reacts into the linearity of the house, but here's something that goes a different direction and might make its own personality known and might be a little bit more organic and natural. And so from that standpoint, what I would say is, look at it and say, explain what you're trying to do and clearly show what you're trying to develop in terms of flat work and any vertical elements. Explain that part of it to it.
Okay.
And then maybe,
Inspiration
throw
photos.
labelings of what's there, kind of give an idea of give an idea of why. Really, that's what I always try to go for why, because I've had people judge work that I've looked at me and they're like, oh, why'd you do that? And I was like, well, you weren't part of the 55 conversations I had with the homeowner where we went from here and then we went over there, right? So give me an idea of what you're trying to achieve, and it'll be really helpful to try and see. But if you pick a material,
And
maybe
any
just give an idea of
inspiration
why and what.
photos any inspiration photos would be helpful
Excellent.
too.
Yeah, it'd be awesome. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Club.
And just one follow-up question on the design challenge. The surface area of, well, the driveway, the shape of the driveway, that we cannot change, right? We can change the material.
Well, I'll say this. So I'm my first name is Greg. It's one letter away from Grey. And I live a huge part of my world. I believe in absolutes, but I also have a huge respect for gray area. And if somebody tells me, well, like, you can't do that, I'll look at it and go, well, maybe we could bend the rules and we could do this. So I'll
Okay.
say this. If you wanted to take a bite out of the driveway because you felt like it was restraining you for some reason, if you wanted to do something into that part of it because you felt like it would enhance it for some reason, absolutely no worries whatsoever. What I would say is you got to get in and out of the driveway. So if it becomes impractical to get in and out of the driveway, well, it's like, well, okay, you changed it, but you didn't make it better.
Right.
But if you changed it and it now enhanced the experience of entering into the property, or collectively took that overall area and made, I actually, as I'm going at it now, I was like, here's another direction I would have gone into it. I'm going to make a little note on that. I wish I had provided that earlier as an option for the homeowner.
No, I get it. I just
But anyway, if you want to manipulate it and change it,
yeah,
never
I
stand
need to
in your way for it.
justify it, basically.
Yeah.
I need to explain clearly.
allow it to remain practical and functional, and you
Yeah.
can change it to whatever you need if
Okay.
need be.
Got it.
Yep,
Thank you.
absolutely. Good question. I love that
Bye.
question.
Hi, Greg.
Hi.
Another question. For the design challenge, I caught just the tail end of what you were saying when I got on. Did you say that you put in another diagram that was a one whole picture with front and back?
So there was, I put one, it wasn't front and back, but I did I gave you a base that was just 8.5 by 11 of just front, and a base that
then
was just
I
back.
have that. Okay,
But
so I
did-
didn't
yeah,
miss that.
yeah.
Okay.
The previous one, I realized I thought it was 8.5 by 11. It turns out that the other one was formatted for 11 by 17.
Okay.
So
That's
that's
fine.
why you probably end up with a scale issue. If you tried to print it out before, it probably squashed it. But this one will be, it's a PDF that if it's printed out and just downloaded, it'll come out to be perfectly 8.5 by 11 for the area that you need for it.
Okay, and when is it due?
The tail end date is June 3rd. Oh, sorry, July 3rd is the drop dead.
That's our next class. Okay.
But yeah, before the beginning of the next class.
Okay.
If I have it beforehand, I'll look at it and we can feather it in. What I probably can't do is it'll be challenging. I'll still have it the night before, so I'll probably work on it a little bit and just see what ones we can pull images from. And I'll probably leave some
Okay.
space in the PowerPoint to illustrate some ideas for. I always just try to pick out the positive of the things and say, okay, we looked at it and saw this theme running through it, or here's a good example of what this was. And like I said, I don't think my example I don't think the one that they chose was the right one. I think it's the one that was the most appropriate for what they saw out of the options they had. So
Okay,
I love
great. All right.
ideas. So
Perfect. Thank you.
thank you. Have a good
Have a
one.
good night. Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Any other questions?
That house, is it stucco?
The house from the design challenge?
Yeah.
It's a combination. The material, well, let's see here. The material is actually it's a highly insulated home, and I can't remember the name of the product right off the top, but it's a vertical board and batten material, and it's a vinyl. Sorry, it's not a vinyl siding. It's a composite board and batten material. So it's two different colors. They're both in a really dark, like one's kind of a dark gray, and one's a little bit. Despite all of our best efforts to make the house different colors, it's a gray and top of a gray. Like a dark and a light gray together. So super trendy for like, you know, like everybody saw forest green in the 1990s, and everybody's wedding was forest green in the 1990s. Everybody's going to look at it. Not that you can see the house, but they're going to go, I see when you sided that home, it's gray on gray. You did that in 20, you know, in the 20 aughts. So, but
Okay,
yeah,
I was trying to like see like what texture it was.
I wish I could remember the manufacturer, but it's one of the things I just didn't store in my head. But it's a really nice, it's a very rigid composite siding with a heavily insulated board behind it. So
Okay. All right. That might
it's
like
helpful.
help me where to go.
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
great. Thank you.
All
I
right, you're
have
welcome.
a probably silly question. Should we be drawing this to scale? Like our
Yeah,
drawing?
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I sort of jumped ahead and I didn't take the prerequisite for this. So this will be my first kind, like attempting something like this. Like I've sort of written like my proposal, I guess. I've just sort of like written out where I want to go, but I just drawing it has been a little bit of a block for me because I've just never done this. So
Yeah.
So yeah,
I have it on good authority that the person that grades it grades on a generous curve.
Okay.
So,
I just, you know, like in my head, I'm like,
really my big part that I'm honestly trying to look for, again, it's not really as much about the design part of it, but what I would like to see is some thought and idea given behind, you know, why you chose the material and why the layout was what it was. You know, if it's a really straight shot to the front door, I'll give you two examples. You know, if it's a really straight shot to the front door and it's a brushed finished concrete or an exposed aggregate concrete with just like, you know, a real jagged angle to it, I would look at that and go, okay, why'd you choose it? And somebody might say, well, at this part of the project, we found that the homeowner ran into budget and they were looking at just getting something into it that was a little bit dynamic, but pretty much, you know, kind of related to the shape of the house a little bit. They didn't just want like a soft curve or something in there. So we chose this angular material and we tried to respond to the shape of it, but we were as cost conscious as possible. And I'm like, cool, that's a great idea. And maybe that blends into it in the future. And it's been interesting for me, I'll say this, because when I wrote the class in winter, we were working on round one. I worked through an R series, an R1, R2, R3 for all my clients.
Yeah.
And I was on I was in between R1 and R2 on the design scope for the landscape part of it. And then by the time we came around to next week, we will have been on R4. And we've, you know, our iterations have been interesting because, you know, the hardscape hasn't morphed too much. We've really done a lot of like emphasis on the planting. Kind of got the hardscapes early on and it wasn't too hard to nail it down, but the materials changed significantly from what we thought originally to what it is now. So that's a fun little clue. It's just, it goes to show to me, like you always have to keep, you know, I think the one thing, like the form is always important and it's nice to have a form that is a good shape that works. But inside that form, you might be able to put in like this material or that material, or this material. And anyway, I hope we have fun looking at it because I think it'll be an interesting example of how to, you know, how to respond to a house in a way that's somewhat predictable, but not super predictable. And I don't know. It was fun to design. They were fun people to work with. They haven't paid me my final bill yet, so I still have some interest in making sure that it's there. So we'll see where it goes. If nothing else, I get the fun of teaching about it. So
no, it's cool. And I think like in my head, I know what I want, but just I'm worried about the drawing, like, you know, trying to bridge the gap between what's in my head and what I've written and then what it looks like.
No, I mean, honestly, if you've got the written part of it and you can give me something to to scale. The other thing that's really nice is, so with that driveway, I believe on one of the base plans, there's a car in the driveway. And so there's two things that'll help you. I would say just as a tip, look at the scale of the car, right? Because the car's about, I think the ones I used in that one were roughly about 16.5 feet long by about 6 feet wide or 6.5 feet wide. And look at the scale of the front door. The front door on this house is a double 36-inch door. So you're going to get a 6-foot opening. So use that as sort of a guide and say, all right, like, you know, you've got about a 6-foot door here. You've got about this for the driveway, and think about that, and just even go through. I think, hold on a second. Yeah, I keep this never leaves my office, right?
Yeah.
I actually, this one never leaves my office. It's my cleanest tape measure because I'm consistently walking around looking at things. My weird design stuff that I do can, like, it might be a piece of furniture, it might be a pavilion, it might be a landscape, it might be, you know, a thing, right?
Mhm.
So I'm always trying to go around and figure out like the ergonomics of stuff, like what the right height is for things. And
Yeah.
some of the things you do, like you have them in your mind. I would say the other thing, hold on one second. The other thing, if you haven't already, I don't know where you are in the process, but in terms of the learning part of it, grab
Yeah.
a sketchbook
Mhm.
and just always keep something like that with you, because, you know, 50% of my sketchbook is notes.
Yeah.
And the other 50% of it is drawing. Well, maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's 80-20. It's mostly drawings, but it's a lot of notes and things that are in there. Sometimes you'll see something, and rather than keep a bunch of loose leaf sheets around that you'll never find, I have drawings that go back, or I have sketchbooks that go back to 1993, maybe. I don't know. I think
Nice.
that's when I first was forced to do a sketchbook.
Yeah.
And then after that, like, I've kept them just as a, you know, if my kids ever read them when I'm gone, right? If
Yeah.
whatever, I sometimes will write like a little handwritten thing in there, like as a joke to them, if they ever see them and read them. But it's nice to be able to do that, because then you can take something, and if you're like, hey, I saw this walkway and I happen to measure it, or I paste it off, just jot a note in there and say, this walkway felt nice and it was the right size. I
Mhm.
ran, you know, I pasted off, or I you know, walked toe to toe across it, and I found out it was 4.5 feet wide. And you're like, perfect. And you'll
Yeah.
never forget that, because once you write it down, like, I know there's, you know, there's Audible Learner, there's just tactiles, there's all those different types of learning styles.
Yeah.
Writing it down is super helpful, because once I write it, I generally commit it to memory at that point. And, you know, it's helpful to be able to go back and find it if you've forgotten it. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is like the newest part. Like, I went to school for fine art for sculpture.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And now I've been in project management for clinical research for many years. So,
Yeah.
but I'm a gardener, and I love, you
Sure.
know, I'm into the planting. So the actual like hardscaping part of it, I'm interested because I loved sculpture in school. Like I did, you know, like
Right.
welding, like all that kind of stuff, molding, but like the measurement side of it, I'm just like, math is not my friend. Numbers are not my friend. That's like the struggle for me. So when I think of
Yeah,
scale,
so-
I get really intimidated by that because I don't fully understand it yet.
What I'll tell you is this. So I don't know if you can see that real well. My camera is pretty rough on these, but these are just,
Yeah.
these are not to scale proportionate examples. And they were studies for a driveway gate.
Yeah.
And all of them are not to scale, but they're proportionate. And I
Yeah.
would say if you're hung up on the idea of scale having to be like this overruling thing, this authority that you want to have on your drawing,
Yeah.
don't just throw out the scale altogether at that point and look at it and say, what's proportionate? And that's why I made the reference about the car and the front door.
That's good.
Because you know that if you go from the front door and suddenly you go to 30 feet wide, you're like, well, that doesn't work, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you go to the front door part of it and you're like, oh, proportionately, this feels about right. And I'm not a touchy-feely, but what I'm saying is,
Yeah.
don't worry about scale at all first, because I literally start every single design project when it comes down to the other part of it without scale. I just lay a sheet of trash paper over the base, and I just sort of like, yeah, this feels about like I want to get from here to there. And then I have one around here somewhere that I'm working on. But anyway,
No,
I just keep it a trash paper and I keep it proportionate. And then as I work down to it, I just refine the shapes, and then it goes into CAD. So
yeah, I'm just such a visual person, and like the details, I'm not I'm like a big picture person, not detail. Like I can weld, but I can't run a bead kind of thing. You know what I mean? So like,
well, if you can weld, you know something about detail. I'll give you that.
I guess it's been a long time.
It's an awesome thing in itself. So I hold that in a high esteem. It's something I've always wanted to learn, because I've always threatened to get into sculptures. But
I loved it. I wish I kept up on it. I went to Kutztown University. You know, it's been a long time now, but yeah. So no, this is good. That makes me feel better, because I was feeling like imposter syndrome. Plus, I didn't take the prerequisite, so I was like, oh crap.
No,
but
I get that. I totally get that. Actually, the previous project that I was at, or the employer that I left to start my own gig, I was charged with being the design manager for the architectural department.
Yeah.
I have formal architectural training. I have a lot of what I'll call it new. I have a lot of experiential training and doing stuff. But
Yeah.
I went to school for landscape architecture. I have a degree in landscape architecture. I've designed a whole bunch of structures and a bunch of homes and other things. But I
Yeah.
have the credentials on my back, so it's a
Right.
different type of thing when you have that part of it. So
Yeah.
don't stress over it. I mean, honestly, like that, I would say is my best accomplice. My little like Pentel 0.25. Find the thing that's there, whatever way that you express that drawing to get the communicate that part of it out on paper. And what I'll tell other people is it's really helpful if you have that narrative or that other piece of it.
Mm-hmm.
I no longer take unless somebody really wants it, I don't take a conceptual meeting with people, because I will generally send them my digital file. I'll let them review it, and there's enough things for people to review.
Yeah.
That we'll talk about a follow-up meeting. We'll get feedback from them, but I don't want to sit down and go, in this drawing, I did this and this and this. Like, they can look at it. People are generally smart enough to figure that out.
Right.
What I do is I give everybody my conceptual, my R1, and
Yeah.
I give if there's 3 concepts, everyone gets a 2-paragraph little executive summary. And
Yeah.
it says, here's the important parts for this. This is why, this is what this one does. And then people can compare and contrast them themselves.
Yeah.
And it gives them a chance and an opportunity to mull it over without me sitting awkwardly in the room going, show and tell time.
Right.
And then when we meet, I'm getting feedback, not having a waste of time meeting where I sit and show my work. I don't need to show
Yeah.
my work.
Yeah.
They can view it and figure it out for themselves, or I did a bad job, right? So
Right. No, I like that. That's good.
yeah. Yep. Cool. Well, good question. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Have a good night.
You as well. Thank you, Anna. Take care.
Bye.
Anybody else on? All right. Peace out, everybody.